It started with a phone call, one that shattered the ordinary rhythm of Steve Powell's life. The kind of call that makes your heart lurch before you even answer. His phone rang late that evening, the number flashing across the screen. Sydney, his only daughter. Dad. Her voice came through, breathless, trembling. Something happened. The words barely registered before she started crying. Steve's grip tightened on the phone. Sydney? What's wrong? Mom's hurt. Her voice cracked. Somebody broke in. There was screaming. There was blood. Dad, I don't know what to do. Steve's heart pounded. He could hear sirens in the background. Sydney, where are you? Are you safe? I think so. The police are here. But there's so much blood. The call cut off. Steve was already grabbing his car keys. When Steve arrived, red and blue lights flooded the street. His home, where he had spent years building a life with his wife, Brenda, and their daughter, was now a crime scene. A police officer held out a hand, stopping him before he could rush inside. Sir, we need you to stay back. That's my family in there, Steve said, his voice shaking. I need to see my wife. The officer's face tightened. Sir, paramedics are working on her now. That was the moment Steve knew. He saw the way the first responders moved inside the house, not with urgency, but with the heaviness of people who had already realized it was too late. A stretcher emerged. His wife, Brenda, was on it, her face pale, her body covered in blood-soaked bandages. A paramedic shook his head at another. Steve's knees nearly gave out. And then he saw Sydney. She was sitting on the front porch, wrapped in a blanket, rocking slightly. Her face was streaked with tears. Blood, was it hers? Splattered her hands and clothes. He rushed to her, dropping to his knees. Sydney? Sweetheart, are you okay? She looked up at him, wide-eyed, lost. I don't understand what happened. Steve pulled her into his arms, holding her as she trembled. Inside the house, crime scene investigators worked in near silence. The living room was in disarray. Shattered glass on the floor, an overturned lamp, streaks of blood leading to the kitchen. Sydney sat with a detective recounting what had happened. Her voice wavered. I was in my room studying, she said. Then I heard yelling Mom's voice. I ran downstairs, and there was this man. What did he look like? The detective asked. I don't know. He was wearing black, a hoodie. I think he had a knife. And then I saw him attacking Mom. She squeezed her eyes shut as tears streamed down her cheeks. I tried to stop him. I fought back. I think he hit me. Then he ran. I don't know where he went. The detective nodded, jotting notes. And you didn't see his face? Sydney shook her head. No. Another officer approached. No signs of forced entry, but the back window is broken. Possibly the intruder's point of entry. The detective frowned but didn't say anything yet. Steve listened to all of this in silence, holding Sydney's hand. None of it made sense. But at that moment, all he cared about was that his daughter was alive. An hour later, an officer approached Steve, his expression unreadable. Mr. Powell, can we talk? Steve glanced at Sydney, who was staring at the floor, still visibly shaken. He squeezed her hand before following the officer outside. The air was crisp, but Steve barely felt it. Is my wife? The officer's face softened. I'm sorry, sir. She didn't make it. The words knocked the breath from Steve's lungs. He staggered slightly, pressing a hand to his forehead. He felt like he was falling. The officer gave him a moment before continuing. Mr. Powell, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask. Have you noticed anything unusual with Sydney lately? Steve blinked. Sydney. The officer hesitated. There are some inconsistencies in her story. Steve's stomach twisted. What are you saying? The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, did your wife mention anything about Sydney being in trouble? Steve shook his head. No. Why? The officer hesitated again before saying, we're still investigating, but we'll need to speak with Sydney again. Steve's pulse pounded. His daughter was a victim, wasn't she? He had never doubted that. Until now. Steve Powell sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. His wife was gone. His daughter was traumatized. And now questions. Inconsistencies. The police weren't saying it outright, but Steve had spent years watching crime reports. He knew when investigators were circling something, or someone. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. This was Sydney, his little girl. Still, the detective's words echoed in his mind. There are some inconsistencies in her story. At first, Steve had dismissed it, but as he replayed the night's events, tiny details stuck out. Sydney said the intruder had worn black and a hoodie, but she hadn't seen his face, not even a glimpse. There was broken glass by the back window, but was that really how someone got in? The alarm system hadn't gone off. And then Sydney, her reaction. She had been in shock, yes, but there was something else. A stiffness in the way she spoke, as if she were reciting lines rather than recalling an attack. Steve exhaled heavily, rubbing his hands over his face. No, he was overthinking. His daughter had just been through a nightmare. He had to be strong for her, but that nagging feeling wouldn't leave. The next morning, Sydney had to go back to the police station for another round of questioning. Steve sat beside her, gripping her hand. She was pale, her fingers ice-cold. A different detective, Detective Harris, led the interview. She was older, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Sydney, I know this is hard," she said gently, "but we need to go over what happened one more time." Sydney nodded slowly. "Okay." Harris flipped through a notepad. "You said you were upstairs when you heard your mother scream?" "Yes," Sydney said. "And you ran down. That's when you saw the intruder attacking her." Sydney swallowed hard. "Yes." Harris tapped her pen. "But, Sydney, when the officers arrived, they found no bloody footprints leading outside. If the intruder ran away, wouldn't he have tracked blood with him?" Sydney hesitated. I don't know. Maybe he wiped his shoes." Harris nodded. "Maybe. But there's something else." She leaned forward. "Your mom fought back. She had defensive wounds. But we didn't find any blood on the walls or floor that wasn't hers." Sydney's face tightened. "Which means," Harris continued, "it's possible the killer never left." Silence. Sydney's hand tensed in Steve's. "I don't." Sydney's voice wavered. "I don't understand what you're saying." Harris sighed, flipping the notepad shut. "Sydney, is there something you're not telling us?" Steve felt his daughter tremble beside him. He turned to her, heart hammering. "Sydney?" he whispered. She looked at him, then really looked at him. And in her eyes, he saw something he didn't want to believe. A flicker of fear. Not fear of what had happened. Fear of being found out. The drive home was silent. Sydney sat curled in the passenger seat, staring out the window. Steve's grip on the wheel was tight. When they got home, Sydney went straight upstairs, locking herself in her room. Steve lingered in the hallway. He needed answers. A horrible thought crossed his mind. One he didn't want to entertain. Slowly, he made his way to the laundry room. The police had taken most of Sydney's clothes for testing, but Steve knew his daughter. If she had done something, if she had hurt Brenda, there might be something she had hidden. He checked the hamper. Nothing unusual. Then he checked the trash. And that's when he saw it. Crumpled beneath old newspapers and an empty cereal box was a small plastic bag. Inside, blood-stained clothes. His breath caught. Not just any clothes. Sydney's hoodie. The one she always wore when she was upset. The blood had dried, but it was there. And in that moment, something inside Steve cracked. He knew. Somehow he had known all along. His daughter had killed his wife. Steve stood outside Sydney's bedroom door, his hands shaking. He knocked once. Silence. "Sydney." His voice was hoarse. "Open the door." No response. He knocked again, harder. "Sydney." The lock clicked. Sydney stood there, her face pale, eyes red from crying. "Dad." Steve held up the bag with the bloodied hoodie. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." Sydney's breath hitched. Tears welled in her eyes. Then her shoulders slumped, and she whispered, "I didn't mean to." Steve felt his heart shatter. His knees nearly buckled, but he forced himself to stay standing. "Sydney, why?" She squeezed her eyes shut, sobs racking her body. She was going to ruin everything. Steve's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" Sydney swallowed hard. "Mom found out. About me. About the things I've done." "What things?" Her hands trembled. "She was going to tell you." A pause. "I couldn't let her." The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Steve had spent years protecting Sydney, loving her. But now, standing in front of his daughter, the same little girl he had once rocked to sleep, he realized something. She wasn't the victim. She was the monster. Steve sat in his study, staring at the blood-stained hoodie. His hands shook as he held it, the weight of his daughter's crime pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. She was going to ruin everything. Sydney's words haunted him. What had his daughter done before this? What else had she been hiding? He had always seen her as his little girl, fragile and sweet. But now, there was something in her eyes. Something dark. Something cold. He had two choices. 1. Protect her. Hide the truth. 2. Do the right thing. But what was the right thing? The father in him wanted to shield her. The man in him, his conscience, screamed for justice. His wife was dead, murdered, and now he had to decide. Would he become an accomplice to protect his child? Sydney came downstairs the next morning, her face pale, her eyes avoiding his. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" Steve clenched his jaw. "We." Sydney looked at him, tears welling up. "I don't want to go to jail. Please." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. The police were already suspicious. The inconsistencies in Sydney's story were growing. If they found the hoodie, if they realized, he had to think. Fast. "Did anyone see you?" he asked. Sydney shook her head. "No. Mom. She was alone." Steve swallowed hard. "Then we get rid of this." He lifted the hoodie. "And we don't talk about it again." A long silence. Then Sydney nodded. "Thank you, Dad." But the way she said it, there was no relief, no gratitude, just an expectation, as if she had always known he would cover for her. And that terrified him. That night, Steve drove out to a secluded spot by the river. He burned the hoodie, watching the flames eat away at the fabric, the blood turning black before disappearing into ash. As the fire crackled, he stared into the darkness, his mind racing. This was just the beginning. Sydney had killed once. Would she do it again? The next day, Detective Harris showed up at their door. Steve's stomach dropped. "Mr. Powell," she said, her sharp gaze scanning his face. "I need to ask Sydney a few more questions." Steve forced a smile. "Of course." Sydney came downstairs, her face a picture of nervousness. Harris didn't waste time. "Sydney, we re-examined the crime scene." She watched Sydney closely. "There's no evidence of forced entry. No footprints leading away from the house. Are you sure you don't remember more about what happened?" Sydney swallowed. I told you everything." Harris tilted her head. "Strange thing, though. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife, it was wiped clean. Too clean. Like someone washed it. But they missed a few spots." Steve's breath caught. Sydney's fingers twitched at her side. "I don't know what you mean." Harris leaned forward. "If there's something you're hiding, now's the time to come clean." Silence stretched between them. Then Sydney did something that made Steve's blood run cold. She smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a grateful one. A calculated, chilling smile. "I told you everything," she repeated. "Maybe you should be looking for the real killer." Steve's stomach twisted. Detective Harris narrowed her eyes but didn't press further. Instead, she stood. "If anything changes, you know where to find me." As soon as she was gone, Steve turned to Sydney. "What was that?" he whispered. Sydney just stared at him, unblinking. "I told you, Dad," she said softly. "You don't have to worry." And for the first time, Steve realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't afraid of being caught. She was enjoying this. Steve knew he couldn't ignore the signs anymore. That night, When Sydney was asleep, he entered her room. He had to know, had to understand what his daughter had become. He searched her drawers, her closet. And then he found it. A small, leather-bound journal tucked under her mattress. He flipped it open. Page after page of writing. At first, it looked normal: school notes, thoughts, random sketches. But then he found the darker entries. I wonder what it feels like to kill. She's always in my way. Maybe I should do it tonight. His hands shook as he read more. There were other names. Other people Sydney had written about. Had she hurt them too? He turned the last page. There, in bold letters, she had written, "Dad won't stop me. He loves me too much." Steve felt sick. He had spent his life protecting his daughter. But now he realized she was a predator, and he was her enabler. Steve sat alone in his study, Sydney's journal open in front of him. His fingers trembled as he traced the words she had written. "Dad won't stop me. He loves me too much." It wasn't a confession. It was a challenge. A declaration that she knew he would protect her, no matter what. Steve felt his stomach turn. This wasn't just about covering up a crime anymore. His daughter was dangerous, and she wasn't done. The question that haunted him now was, who would be next? The next morning, Steve watched Sydney carefully. She moved around the house as if nothing had changed, humming while making breakfast, scrolling through her phone, casually talking about school. But Steve could see through it now. Every smile was calculated. Every word was rehearsed. And then she asked a question that made his blood run cold. "Dad?" she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Do you think the police will ever catch who did it?" Steve swallowed hard. "I don't know." Sydney leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "If they do, what do you think will happen to them?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were waiting for something. Waiting for him to say he'd protect her. Waiting for him to confirm what she already believed. Steve forced a neutral expression. "Depends on who it is." Sydney smiled. "I guess we'll find out." Steve's heart pounded. She was testing him. And worse, she was enjoying it. Later that day, Steve stepped outside for air. That was when he saw Mrs. Holloway, their elderly neighbor, watching him from her porch. "Steve," she called, her voice low. He walked over, forcing a smile. "Morning." She didn't return it. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, then leaned in. "I heard something that night," she whispered. Steve felt his pulse quicken. "What did you hear?" Mrs. Holloway hesitated. Voices, arguing, and then a scream. Steve's throat tightened. "And," she added, "I saw someone leave the house." Steve's blood ran cold. Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice. "It was Sydney, wasn't it?" He wanted to deny it, to say she was mistaken. But the way she looked at him, sad, knowing, he realized there was no point. I don't know what you're talking about," he said weakly. Mrs. Holloway sighed. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Then, she gave him a look he wouldn't forget. "Be careful, Steve. I don't think your daughter is done yet." That night, Steve barely slept. Sydney's journal. The way she was testing him. Mrs. Holloway's warning. It was all adding up to something horrifying. Sydney wasn't just covering up a crime. She was seeing how far she could go. And Steve was starting to realize he might not be able to stop her. The next morning, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through the news on her phone. "Dad," she said, not looking up. "Mrs. Holloway was outside again last night." Steve's breath caught. "What about her?" Sydney smiled slightly. "She talks a lot, doesn't she?" Steve's blood turned to ice. He forced a calm tone. "Sydney, what are you saying?" She finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Just that people who talk too much tend to get themselves in trouble." A long silence stretched between them. Steve's mind raced. Mrs. Holloway. Sydney saw her as a threat. And if Sydney had killed once, what was stopping her from doing it again? Steve stood abruptly. "I have to go." Sydney tilted her head. "Where?" He didn't answer. He grabbed his keys and left. He needed to think. And more than that, he needed to decide. Was he going to stop his daughter? Or was he going to protect her? Steve sat in his car outside the police station, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. If he walked inside, if he told them the truth, Sydney would go to prison. His daughter, the little girl he had raised, loved, protected. He thought about his wife, about Mrs. Holloway, about the darkness in Sydney's eyes. Then he thought about the next person, because there would be a next person. Steve exhaled shakily, and he made his choice. He stepped out of the car and walked into the station. Detective Harris looked up as Steve entered. "Mr. Powell?" she said, surprised. Steve swallowed hard. "I need to talk." Harris narrowed her eyes. "About what?" Steve clenched his fists. "My daughter." The room went still. Harris leaned forward. "Go on." Steve took a deep breath. And then, in a quiet, shaking voice, he told her everything. An hour later, police arrived at the house. Sydney was on the couch when they knocked. Steve stood nearby, his stomach in knots. "Miss Powell," Detective Harris said, stepping inside. "We need you to come with us." Sydney blinked. "Excuse me?" Harris glanced at Steve. "Your father told us everything." Sydney turned slowly to look at him, and for the first time, Steve saw something in her eyes that he hadn't before. Not anger, not fear, betrayal. "You told them?" she whispered. Steve's throat tightened. "Sydney, I had to." Her face twisted. "You promised." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't real. Not this time. She wasn't sad. She was furious. As the officers cuffed her hands, she whispered, "You'll regret this." Steve felt his chest tighten. Because the worst part? He knew she meant it. The truth is, sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that define us. How far would you go to protect someone you love? At what point does love become dangerous? This story isn't just about crime. It's about choices, consequences, and the hidden darkness within us all. If this story gripped you, subscribe for more chilling tales, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's discuss. What would you have done in Steve's place?